And it's my pleasure to warmly welcome you to this event with Student Minds and the UPP Foundation. And we're here to primarily discuss the new Student Minds report, which outlines the impact of climate change on student mental health. Our webinar is going to last for an hour, and I'll run you through the format so you know what's going to happen. We're going to hear some brief introductory remarks from Richard, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then Jenny is going to talk us through the main findings of the report. We'll then have a panel discussion, leaving time at the end for some questions. So if you are listening and watching, please do submit your questions using the Q&A function, and also upvote the questions that you would like to be asked to the panel. If you submit the question with your name, we should be able to mute you when I call on you to ask your question, or you can post anonymously and I will ask your question to the panel. So let me start by introducing our speakers and panelists for today. We have Richard Brabner, the director of the UPP Foundation, a charity that offers grants to universities, charities, and higher education bodies. Richard has also worked as a head of policy at the University of Hertfordshire and as a researcher for 2 members of Parliament. We also have Jenny with us, Jenny Smith, who's the policy manager at Student Minds. Jenny delivers research, briefings, and analysis to empower the whole Student Minds team. She keeps a finger on the pulse of the higher education and mental health sectors and is passionate about grassroots activism, co-production, and student leadership. We have Rosie Tressler, who is the CEO of Student Minds. Rosie leads the organisation, developing the charity's direction, strategy, and future opportunities. Rosie has undertaken a Churchill Fellowship to explore preventative approaches to student mental health and was awarded an OBE in 2019 for services to mental health in higher education. I'm delighted that Eddie Rose is joining us today. Eddie is an 18-year-old activist, particularly interested in child rights, climate justice, and empowering young people to make a difference. He's been involved in climate campaigns and helped to organise a youth climate conference in 2022. Eddie's currently on his gap year and working with students organising for sustainability. And Eddie has joined us at the last minute, so we really are grateful for you joining us today. I'm Professor Evelyn Welsh, who is the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Bristol. Evelyn was previously Senior Vice President for Service, People and Planning at King's College London, and has also worked at the Universities of Essex, the Warburg Institute, and at Queen Mary, University of London. Okay, Richard, if I can pass to you to get us started, please.
Thanks, Rose, and welcome and hello, everybody. It's great to be here today to help launch this report, which has been expertly put together by our partner, Student Minds. So as a foundation, we've had a really constructive and positive long-term relationship with Student Minds. They were actually the first recipient of our first ever grant, which was around a student accommodation pilot at NTU, which then, of course, led us to developing or funding the University Mental Health Charter, which Student Minds have obviously put together. And so we're really delighted to support this research, which was one of the 8 grants we funded during our previous funding round. We supported this project because it's addressing an issue which hasn't really been looked at properly before. And with universities announcing ambitious net zero targets, while simultaneously 96 higher education providers now going through the University Mental Health Charter, we know that both of these issues are critical to the future of our sector. There's been a lot of commentary and noise around things like eco-anxiety. So what does this really mean for students at university? What is the relationship between the climate emergency and student well-being? So we were delighted, as I said, to fund this project as an innovative idea which looks at the correlation between these 2 crucial issues, which individually impact the student experience, but together could overwhelm our efforts to support students. And our aim for this research was simply to start a conversation in the sector on ways to support students navigate the climate emergency with an eye to their well-being, of course. And I hope that you find the research, the findings and the recommendations as interesting and as stimulating as we do. So thank you. I'm now going to pass back to Rose and then hear from Jenny.
Thank you so much, Richard. And over to you, Jenny. Jenny's going to share some slides with us and talk us through the highlights of the report.
Thank you, everyone. I think that should be my slides up. So I'm going to whistle through these as I'm mindful of time. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I will say that the full report is available on our website. So there we go. So first of all, a comment on the key themes that we've highlighted through our report. So what we really noticed coming through from our literature review, our survey and our focus groups were themes spanning from the individual right through to the structural. So what we found is that our student participants were experiencing climate change and thinking about climate change right from their personal impact on their lives all the way through to how it impacts our systems of government, international relations and wider society. So a few of the themes that have come out from our research, which we'd like to highlight, are the intersection of sustainability and psychological wellbeing in the curriculum, leadership and responsibility, and this can be in a personal sense or an institutional sense, the impact of climate change on thoughts, feelings, and behaviour, which we'll delve more into, and on the flip side, the role of green spaces in the natural world in promoting positive mental wellbeing. Additional themes we'd like to talk about are uncertainty, agency, and control, the role of UK higher education institutions and the government. And then, of course, we'll have a bit of a discussion about the impact on particular student groups who may be affected differently. So a few examples there we've got our international students, disabled students, student parents, those from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds and more. A selection of our findings. So first of all, 90% of our respondents did say that in the preceding 4 weeks, climate change had impacted their thoughts, feelings, or behaviour at least some of the time. So we've got a variety of feelings and experiences here, but a few of the most common. We've got frustration and anger, overwhelmingly, that not enough is being done about climate change, whether there's a sense of denial by those in power, whether that's a sense that there's a lack of progress being made. There's concerns or anxiety about the impact on future generations, and indeed about the impact on themselves personally and their future. Got grief about biodiversity loss and wildlife extinction, which I think is a really interesting point because what we found from our focus group participants, that's a very visually comprehensible indicator of the changes. So you see the wildlife loss in your environment, you see the changes to your ecosystem. But interestingly, the third item there is one which we characterize as more positive, which is that 37% of our participants say, often or always in the previous 4 weeks, they made a positive change to their lifestyle to limit their contributions to climate change. Going into it a bit more, there's a lot to cover, so I just want to highlight a couple of these here. So interestingly, the majority of our respondents wanted to learn about sustainability in their curriculum, and a fifth of our respondents already had. That being said, we found that the respondents who had learned about sustainability in their curriculum, the majority of them reported a negative experience or association afterwards, so whether that was negative feelings such as feeling defeated or having the sense of concern but not knowing where to go, feeling anxious or disengaged. And of course, this is exactly what we don't want to see because we can't ignore climate change. It's not going to go away. And what we also found is that our students really do want to make a difference. And across academic disciplines, there's a real desire to have a meaningful contribution to tackling climate change through their studies and through their career. The issue is our students don't necessarily know where to go and to make those meaningful changes. This being said, we noticed that a fifth of our participants, often or always, as I said, reported having a positive conversation about climate change in the preceding 4 weeks. So there's an interesting element there of students wanting to make a difference, in some ways feeling like they can, but then when they get a bit more of information about it and learn more, sometimes they feel disengaged and they don't know where to go next. So it's a really interesting point there about how do we channel this concern and passion. And I've spoken a bit to the role of careers and interdisciplinary studies and commitment to tackling climate change. Another interesting thing which we found out was that the majority of our respondents do actually engage with the natural world, the outdoors, or green spaces in order to maintain their well-being from their perceptions. So the most popular way this was done was through physical exercise and sports, but we had a really broad range of things. So we've got gardening and wildlife appreciation there, but it could just be having a picnic outside with friends. We had some students engaging in things like litter picks. We had some students, one student said, oh, sometimes, this sounds silly, but I just like to go outside and turn the soil over. and encourage and redistribute the nutrients. But that was something they genuinely said to help them feel a sense of contribution to their communal space. And we know from our university mental health charter that that sense of belonging and sense of ownership over a space is really important. I'm going to leave this here because I'm mindful we've got a lot to cover, but I do encourage everyone to get engaged with the discussion and do get in touch if there's anything you'd like to share with us.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for taking us through your findings. So we're going to hear from our panelists for their reflections on the report. So we're going to go to Rosie Tressler first, then Eddie, then to Evelyn Welsh, and then back to Richard. So Rosie, your thoughts, please.
Thanks, Rose. Good morning, everyone. And I want to start by thanking every single student that shared their story with us, and thank the UPP Foundation, HEPI, and the range of colleagues across the sector that have supported us with launching this important work. In the start of our report, you'll find a foreword from me, which will probably feel like a bit more of a rallying cry of how we're thinking about this issue and how we hope that the sector is responding. But for today, I thought it might be helpful if I begin with some light context on where we are at with the climate emergency internationally. And if I could ask you, while you're listening to me, I promise you I will move on to a more hopeful space than a gloomy one. But if I could ask you to just think about how you feel in response to some of this context, that would be brilliant. So first of all, many of you will know that all of the world's governments signed the Paris Agreement at the 2015 COP conference. And that meant agreeing to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial revolution levels, and also agreed they would pursue efforts to actually make it more like 1.5 degrees. And this is because that would have significantly reduced the impact and risks and the effects of climate change. Unfortunately, at the moment, it looks like even that 2-degree limit will be exceeded. And I think if you've been watching the news this summer, or you've been looking actually at the research data, it's really clear we're experiencing more extreme weather events, things like floods, droughts, windstorms, wildfires, all as a result of human-induced climate change. And we've seen in the news again just how much this is affecting people around the world. So we already know that since 2008, around 370 million people have been displaced as a result of climate disasters. And just last year, that was about 36 million alone. There's lots of hard things going on in the world right now, but it's really striking, isn't it? I mean, it's impossible for us to even comprehend, think about just how many people's lives are already being affected. And many of you will know that the communities most impacted are often those that are from the global majority, or what people from minoritized communities in this country. And we know that this is likely to keep increasing. Estimates from the Institute for Economics and Peace predicting about 1.2 million people displaced by 2050. So this is huge. And we're seeing this also in terms of how this is affecting crops, our food production systems. So corn, wheat, and rice. We know that as climate change gets worse, that will start to affect that. It will start to affect how countries interact with each other. So this is kind of, I'm saying all of this, not because I want people to retreat, far from it, because actually what we're realizing is how unnecessary it is for us to confront these realities head on. And this is just a snippet of what students and members of our communities, which for a lot of us on this webinar at universities, what they're reading and learning about and absorbing. And is it really any wonder why this is causing feelings of distress, of grief, of worry about the future? I think I asked you to think about how you feel. I mean, I think when I hear this news, I feel all the feelings that students talked about in the report that Jenny set out. So we really wanted to understand this further. And, you know, as well as this research that Jenny's spoken to and we're launching today, We've been trying to do what we can to learn more about that relationship between the climate crisis and mental health. And I want to give a shout out to someone who I know is on the webinar today, which is Dr. Emma Lawrence, who's based at Imperial and works in the climate cares group, who are doing some really amazing internationally leading work in a very collaborative and thoughtful way with nations around the world as well, really understanding this relationship. And it's clear that it's bidirectional. It's that what's happening in the environment affects our mental health. How we are in terms of our mental health affects how we interact with these issues around climate. And we know in the broader mental health literature as well that environmental factors like pollution, like housing, like all these things that are affected by climate hugely affect our mental health and our outcomes. So I think as someone who has actually worked, who isn't an environmental campaigner by background, as someone who has worked in the sector focused on mental health for over a decade, I'm really concerned that we are going to see a rollback on really hard fought progress to improve the mental health of our communities, because the climate change is a threat to all of that. It can damage our health services and supply chains. Mental health professionals are already seeing this show up in the therapy room. And, you know, we take a social policy focus rather than a clinical one here. You know, we're not seeking to pathologize what is actually a very understandable, rational response to the state of things and the threat to life. But where that leaves us as a charity is, I think, actually, let's listen to what students are saying about what makes a difference. Let's really engage with that, because what is clear is if all our different types of institutions can pull together, there is an opportunity to change direction, to have a more sustainable future. And there are plenty of examples in our sector of things that we know can help people right now. We can create spaces where people can talk about what they're feeling in relation to this change. There's some examples from Climate Cares around like journaling projects that can help people to process the emotional impact. And as Jenny's pointed to as well, students know that if they're able to be active and volunteer, have green jobs in the future, all of these things build us with hope and optimism. And I'm really inspired by the role that universities are already playing and can play even more in that. So I'll leave it there and hand over to our next colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosie. And I think we're going to pick up on your really important point about hearing from students. So Eddie, we're not expecting you to speak for all students, but we are really interested in what you have to say. So over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. Thank you for these guys for inviting me on. As I said, I'm an activist. I'm working on a project with Students Organising for Sustainability UK called Teach the Teacher. And it's all about getting climate education in secondary schools. And when we do this Teach the Teacher, we run a training session with students. So we enable them to be able to teach their teachers about climate change. And during this training session, we talk to them about climate anxiety. And there's a section where we do two things. Before that, we do a little quiz and we ask them, what do they think, how many refugees do they think will be caused by climate change? And it's really interesting then after that to go on to talking to them about climate anxiety and then how their teachers can help them with climate anxiety. And there's something that stuck out to me about this, which was there was a school and they do lots of environmental things already. And the students were really worried about climate change. But when we came to the climate anxiety section, they said to us who were doing the session that they weren't that worried about, they weren't that worried. They didn't feel as much climate anxiety as, say, another group might, because their school was already involved in all these eco activities. They felt like they were making a difference. They felt like they were part of an environment, a space that was contributing to a better environment, and that was helping their mental health, and that was helping them with their climate anxiety. So that's the thought I want to start on. I think all young people, especially those involved in the climate movement have experienced or will experience some level of climate anxiety. For me, it's often, especially in the media and in our own reading, it is this kind of existential threat that's looming over our lives. And as young people, things are already really complicated and difficult with social media, causing having issues with mental health. So cost of living crisis, all sorts of different complicated things going on, climate change, social media, all of this adds up to a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. And so I was really, when I was reading the report, one of the things I really liked was that it mentioned, there was a quote from one of the young people in one of the focus groups, which said that they kind of see it as a whole thing. It's not just climate anxiety, but it's interlinked with lots of different things. And I think that really stuck out to me, because the climate crisis is interlinked with social justice crises, with a whole range of things to do with inequality and to some degree oppression and mental health, as we're talking about today. So that was another thing that really stuck out to me. So personally, it's stressful. The idea that our future may be under threat, but it's also frustrating because this didn't happen to people before us, didn't happen to older generations, and it's also frustrating that people don't seem to be doing things about it. Governments don't seem to be taking action. We keep hearing new reports from the IPCC every year, or every however many years, that it's, and I mean, I don't know how many things that you've read online that say this is our last chance, this is a really big issue. I've seen so many things that say we really need to do things, and then I've seen so few things where people are actually doing things, and that's really frustrating. That's another thing that's talked about in the report, and I definitely recommend you read the report, by the way. It's really brilliantly put together, and it's a really, really good summary of what people are thinking. And there's several sections about frustration, and they mention people's anger at inaction. And what I really like is that then it's followed by a list of recommendations for both the government and universities. I definitely recommend checking out those recommendations because there's some really, really good points in there. The ones that stuck out to me was the recommendations for universities to set up green spaces and involve young people in community initiatives, and also divest from fossil fuels, because it talks about inaction causing frustration and that causing problems with students' mental health. One of the things that really stuck out to me again from the report was the what young people were saying, and this gave me a bit of optimism because a lot, it's mentioned several times in the report that the young people in the focus groups were talking about the fact that climate change is going to affect people in the global south and other areas disproportionately. And this is something that's really important to me, because often when people say to me about climate change that it's going to happen in the future, I then have to tell them, yeah, it's going to happen in the future, but it's also happening now. It's happening, it's causing extreme weather in other countries, and people, there's problems now, and it's only going to get worse. So it really gave me hope that the young people that Student Minds spoke to were really well informed about this and were really passionate. And we're talking particularly about this issue of climate justice, which is really important. A quote that stuck out that I noticed from the report said that people are really feeling despondency and a lack of empowerment. They feel like no one's listening to them, no one's going to help them achieve what they want to achieve. And this really chimed a chord with me, especially because I know people who would be interested in kind of climate activism and that kind of thing if it didn't feel so hopeless. And I think it definitely does. Again, when we were doing our training session for my Teach the Teacher project, one of the things that we mention is climate anxiety can be, it can motivate people to do climate activism. It can motivate people to try and help, but it's also a blocker. It also stops people from engaging in things that could be really helpful to them, could be really meaningful. So yeah, this is another thing that occurred to me, and I think that links in with what I mentioned before about the climate crisis being interlinked with things, and there being a mental health crisis as a whole. So I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I think that brings me to my time, I think, almost, but I'm very quickly going to mention the fact that SOS the final thing that struck a chord with me was SOS UK do some projects that are similar to the ones that were mentioned in the Student Minds report, such as the stuff about the green spaces and our focus on climate education. So it's basically a really good report, and it's exciting, and it does give me hope that there's a cohesive movement towards improving students' mental health and in the environment at the same time, because that's the kind of the other side of this. Although they are a combined crisis, it means that we can also tackle them both together and help people and the environment as a result. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Eddie. I think your point about the number of concerns that students have and are living with that interlink and the impact that has on their mental health is really interesting. So let's now hear from Evelyn, Vice Chancellor of Bristol. Please give us your thoughts, Evelyn, on the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. So the report does an interesting thing, which is to take two circles of real concern for universities, not just in the UK, but globally. Student mental health and anxiety, which we know from many other reports sponsored by UPP, but very much underpinned by the work that Student Minds does. So thank you, Rosie, for all that you do. And that set of anxieties, and then the climate emergency, which all universities take really seriously. And creating that overlap, I think putting aside terms like eco-anxiety, there are some really interesting overlaps. Now, this is a really small scale report, and the respondents were self-selected. So much more research will be needed. The University of Bristol itself we did do our own report, a slightly different report, and one which answers one of the first questions in the Q&A. This was done by our interdisciplinary research institute, the Brigstow Institute, and the report's called From Anxiety to Insight to Action. How can we best support young people from diverse backgrounds to make their own response to the climate and ecological emergency? And that group of Bristol researchers worked with a charity, the Creative Youth Network, which is 13 to 23-year-olds in the city with neurodiverse issues and disabilities. And what we found there was actually not dissimilar from what we've been hearing before. That is, this was an incredibly well-informed group of young people, probably because they had already formed a network, they had a chance to talk amongst themselves. There were issues. Frustration was the number one word that was mentioned. We know what we need to do. Why aren't we putting it into action? But also in terms of managing their own concerns and anxiety, the fact that they had informed themselves, that they did understand what they could do as individuals, but more importantly, what they could do as a group, actually helped deal with that anxiety. So having a common cause actually supported what you might call their sense of belonging, their sense of having a community with whom they could share concerns. Because what we're seeing at the University of Bristol in terms of the broader issues around mental health and anxiety, which are serious, and we mustn't in any way underplay them. And the issues around climate change are not emerging as a specific concern. Instead, it's the broader issues shared by the majority of students, and here we're talking about just under 50% of our students who might report some form of anxiety, are things like academic success. And am I going to do as well as I thought I would when I arrived? Real concerns and stress around exam periods. And friendship, and loneliness emerge as an absolutely central concern. And then cost of living crisis. So those remain the top mental health triggers, along with many others. And then on the other side, you have groups and networks of students and staff working inside and outside the university on how do we genuinely put into action what we already know works, particularly not only in terms of climate change and things like developing new clean fuels like hydrogen, but also in terms of biodiversity and using our gardens, our land, our spaces around our student residences to create really great spaces that not just encourage but also support the biodiversity that we want to see in Bristol. So while I welcome the report, I think that we need to be careful not to see eco-anxiety as something new. And students and staff have always been concerned about long-term futures. That's what makes being at a university so incredible, because you're thinking about 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now, not just the day after tomorrow. I'm showing my age. In my time, it was CND and real anxieties similar to these around nuclear war. We were able to actually intervene and reduce that risk. Here, I think rightly, students and staff are coming together to deal with the real issues, which I agree with Eddie are here today. In actually creating that community of action, we can actually support student mental health. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Evelyn, and particularly interesting, I think, to hear your work on biodiversity on your campus, which must be a challenge given that most of your campus is in the middle of a beautiful city, and finding green space must be tricky.
We have about 1,000 acres. We have a campus out in Langford, which is our vet school, and we have acres and acres of ground out there, as well as within the city. Urban green environments are really possible, and students are fantastic at taking any patch of space, concrete or otherwise, and transforming it into a place to grow either food or wildflowers.
Amazing, thank you.
We even have hedgehogs on our campus.
Ah, there you go. Richard, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to pick up on that, we did a piece of work with the Civic University Network a year or so ago on the role of universities' civic role in terms of sustainability and climate, in terms of, and what we found was from the regional workshops, there was a real different approach to biodiversity, but it's perhaps even more important in urban environments to focus on that, given the impact that can be made. And just yesterday, some of the colleagues at UPP were on a volunteering away day. We were at Cody Dock in East London, supporting the environment there, and lots of biodiversity initiatives that we're getting involved with. So a positive and constructive way for us to support the local environment. Anyway, I just wanted to quickly reflect on the report, with my reflections mainly focused on higher education sector rather than the broader recommendations around the government, with the caveat, of course, as Evelyn was right to note, that this is a small scale piece of research which we funded, self-selected survey and so on. So it is around sparking the conversation rather than any firm conclusions. But I've got three main reflections and one broader comment that I just want to make. The first one, sort of similar to what both Eddie and Evelyn were talking about, was around being positive and enabling students to feel that they can make a difference. I was really struck by the findings that students widely expressed a desire to make a positive contribution to tackling climate change, but often felt like they didn't know where to start. And we know from others, including Hannah Ritchie from Our World in Data at the University of Oxford, that catastrophizing climate change rarely works. It can actually make people feel helpless and reduce action rather than help people tackle environmental issues. So I suppose to support both student well-being and provide constructive ways to make a difference to the environment. You know, we really fully support the recommendation that universities need to facilitate these opportunities through a variety of means, including green placements, supporting sustainable initiatives and good practice in their local communities, co-designing built and natural environments on campus with students, the biodiversity piece that we were just talking about. The second point, which is sort of related to the first, but more specifically about the curriculum, the report includes a really important finding that well over half of students want sustainability embedded in the curriculum. And so there's a really opportunity here to connect the agenda around student belonging, as Evelyn mentioned, graduate outcomes, and tackling environmental issues. I'm a big advocate of what they call service learning in the United States. It's something, of course, we featured quite heavily in the Student Futures Commission that we ran. And this is where a student is credited as part of their degree for a set number of hours of practical learning in their community that might be with a social enterprise, a charity, or a local business. And this approach is beneficial as it is universal or mandatory, meaning that all students, regardless of background or mode of study, benefit, embedding some of the sort of immersive elements of the student experience into the curriculum, you know, which can really tackle issues around loneliness for certain groups of students and embed social capital. Now, we've funded a separate project with Yorkshire universities to establish service learning pilots with their members focused on sustainability issues. So by embedding sustainability within the curriculum, we can support a student's well-being, we can support their graduate outcomes and improve the local environment. So what we call a win-win-win. The third point, quickly, is about meaningful action, about what a university, about ensuring taking on board the research for a university or SU, focusing on what we call meaningful action rather than what I might call fads, which often do more harm for the cause of sustainability than any good. Students, as the survey shows, wants the sector to focus on transitioning to renewable energy, better waste management and biodiversity. They don't want in any large numbers you to focus on trendy things such as banning meat or limiting choice for students. So students really believe that these are sort of the issues that the individual should make rather than the university making the choice for them. So I think it's really important that we listen to students and focus on what really matters to them. And then my final broader point is around authenticity. Lots of universities and lots of businesses and organizations have really ambitious net zero commitments, and these are going to be a real challenge to meet. But what really matters is less of the goal, but more the delivery of that goal. And with as well as the director of the UPP Foundation, I'm director of ESG at UPP. So with my ESG hat on, last May we published our first sustainability report, which was published in accordance with Global Reporting Initiative standards. And that report sets out our priorities for the environment, our priorities for social purpose, and our governance programme. And as part of our GRI standards, we have committed to publishing annually a review of our performance and the progress we're making towards our 2030 goals. Now, this for us is obviously particularly important for our key stakeholders, such as our university partners and our funders, to ensure that there's real credibility in what we're doing in terms of our ESG approach. Similarly, I think it's probably really important for universities to bring students with them, as we try to do with our stakeholders, on their net zero journey. And I'm sure there are many great examples of institutions doing this, regularly communicating plans and successes and being transparent about progress towards their environmental targets, their net zero goals and so on. And I think what this report really shows is that students would welcome that, both in terms of understanding what the university is trying to do, but also to give them the inspiration that the institutions that they're part of are making collectively a difference. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. Okay, so if I can ask panelists to pop their cameras back on, and we're going to take some questions. I am aware of time, so I'm probably going to take a couple of questions at once. And panelists, if you give me a nod if you'd like to answer that question, we don't have to come to everyone for every question. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee, which I am going to read out. And then I have a question and I'm sorry if I pronounce your name incorrectly, from Rabin. So please come on, and Emma will unmute you and introduce yourself properly and ask us your question. So the first anonymous question says, how different do you think the findings would have been if the research had been undertaken with young people who are not students? And Evelyn, you touched on this already a little bit. In other words, are students typical of other people or different with respect to their views on climate change? And hopefully we can hear from Rabin as well. Hello.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, so I guess one of the things I've looked at is that I previously worked in wellbeing and actually now work in the environment. So, from my experience is that I just think there is a gap between what people don't understand when we're looking at climate change is people's ability to take on the tasks to become net zero compliant or, working with SDGs. And in terms of student well-beings and think about that globally, what do you think more could be done to tackle that very important issue, in my opinion?
Amazing, thank you so much. So if we first talk about students and non-students, who would like to pick up on the differences between those?
I think Eddie has to. Oh, Rosie's gone there, but it seems to me Eddie was the only person who could.
Rosie, go ahead, but Eddie, I'm going to come to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. Eddie will much more said than me. I just wanted to point to actually some wider research that has been done in the mental health sector. So Young Minds, which is a charity that we often connect with, did a fantastic report earlier this year involving thousands of young people called Deconstructing the System. And there was a whole section where they looked at how kind of global issues were impacting young people's mental health more broadly. And within that, 87% of the young people that they were surveying highlighted their worry about climate change. So I think just to give that counterbalance, really, that, organisations who've looked more, not just thinking about student status, this is coming up routinely as well. But yeah, Eddie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, my friends, I have friends who gone to uni. I have friends who decided not to go to uni, and I think it can be I think it can really depend on the individual, because there are some people who are really passionate about environmental things, for example, but don't go to uni. In terms of how it affects people, it's a tricky question, and it would be interesting to do some research to compare this. But I would imagine that a lot of university students who do more academic things and therefore kind of look at topics in more detail and are potentially more inclined to kind of do more research, look into things in more detail, that kind of thing. I would imagine that they would be kind of slightly more affected by climate anxiety due to the way they the way that they kind of look into things, if that's making any sense. But I've got friends who haven't gone to university and are still very much affected by climate anxiety, and often people I've got some friends who haven't gone to university and are struggling with mental health for different reasons. So it's a very complicated question, actually, because you're getting into the questions of why people become students and not, and that kind of thing. So I suppose that, yeah, all young people, a percentage of all young people are affected by mental health issues, and some of them will be affected by climate anxiety. But then in terms of people who look into climate anxiety, I imagine that students would be slightly more likely in that respect. Hopefully that helps.
Rose, can I try to bring both questions together? Because of course the big difference, the big opportunity that a university offers is structure. And Richard mentioned service learning. I can see Kat Thorne is on the call. She created a climate action network at King's College London, which had 250 staff and students on it. So universities can actually be really proactive in offering structure, embedding sustainability into the curriculum. Bristol offers open units that any student can enroll on, including one on city futures, migration, citizenship, and planetary change. So we offer a chance to do something that's legal, to do something that's impactful, and to do something where you gain skills for the future. And that, I think, is where universities have a particular responsibility, perhaps not just to lean into the student community, but also to connect to the broader civic community. And that's what service learning does. That's what climate action networks do, where you might actually be working on insulation projects. You might be doing research. You might be doing citizen science research about what's really working in terms of improving water quality. And universities are part of the solution. And that's why I think we can really offer some great examples.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to take one more comment on Robin's question about well-being, that we're asking students to tackle this immense, challenge that we're going to face in the future. That they will be the people who really will be doing this work, and yet they're also, struggling with the mental health crisis. And how can we expect that, and how can we support that? Rosie or Jenny, I'm not sure if you want to jump in on that one.
Sorry, I was having a little issue with my camera there. So in terms of supporting young people who are working or campaigning and being activists in this space, particularly students, I think one thing that's really coming through is the enthusiasm and the willingness to be a meaningful part of this solution. And I think so many our panelists have all touched on this in different ways. We're talking about, I think, meaningful action as opposed to, as Richard said, fads. We're talking about, as Eddie says as well, there's an acknowledgement of what needs to be done, so why aren't we doing it? And so I think there needs to be a meaningful co-production and engagement with students and young people. What I say that when I mean meaningful, because you have to use substance when we're talking about this, is decisions that are made with students need to actually have consequences, whether they're strategic consequences, whether they're in terms of finances and operations. It's great to hear from Professor Welsh and the things that Bristol are doing, for instance, to incorporate students meaningfully into the kind of, whether it's green spaces on campus, whether we talk about green social prescribing as an option or to be explored in the report. I also think there's a real role for students' unions in here, which we didn't get a chance to touch on as much as I'd like in the report. But students' unions are, of course, the representative bodies, democratic membership organisations representing students, and they're already doing some really fantastic work, whether that's in their local communities, their university communities, but also actually role modelling activism and initiatives, practice for wider society as well. We have wells of expertise in the higher education sector, both from our students and young people, but also from the researchers and academics involved. So let's utilize what we've got available to us. Let's actually deliver, I think, on the changes that everyone acknowledges need to be made. As it's interesting as well, that reflection from Eddie as well, I think that really struck me in terms of when we know something's being done, when students can see, or young people can see that there's actually meaningful action being taken, that can in a way be reassuring. And it's interesting to me that in the report as well, we see where young people or students do engage with actions which limit their contributions and they feel making a positive change, they feel better. And that's the main way they respond to their distress associated with climate change. So basically, and it sounds really obvious, actually doing something about climate change in a substantial way and committing to action even when that's difficult and delivering on that in a way where students have meaningful buy-in, I think is, from what I can tell initially at this stage, one of the best ways to help students feel supportive, so they know all this work is going somewhere and their frustration can be addressed.
Amazing, thank you. Okay, a couple of related questions here. Susan Lee has asked a question about how universities can partner with students. It seems like a golden opportunity to do so, to address climate change at each institution, enable collective action, and foster a greater sense of agency and hope. And on probably quite a similar note, Josh, I'm going to come to you, and hopefully we can hear from you, Josh, and hear your question.
Hi, yes. So I think Jenny's already partly answered this question, but I was wondering about students' unions. I know students' unions are among the most sort of proactive in the area of sort of both actually in responding to mental health and also in climate activism. I was wondering, is there a role for students' unions in addressing these issues, and what specific recommendations would you give them if they're interested in addressing them?
Okay, so working with students and recommendations for students' unions. Who would like to pick up on those? Yeah, please go ahead, Eddie.
I'm going to jump in on the student unions ones. The organisation I'm representing today, the one I work for, Students Organising for Sustainability UK, have all sorts of programmes that student unions can get involved in on their website. And they're a really great organisation, so definitely get involved with them.
Brilliant, thank you. Richard.
So one thing both for SUs and universities is to make things easy for students. You know, we see there can often be a difference between opinion and what people want to do and their behaviour, and that's because they might find it too difficult. So UPP corporately actually works with SOS around a behaviour change initiative in some of its student residences, which has made actually a really big difference in terms of energy usage in those halls. You know, to support the sort of the climate, to support our climate commitments and so on. So ensuring that things, whether it's how we communicate to them, whether it's nudge initiatives, whether it's something else, it's actually, you know, something tangible that students can do. I suppose my other recommendation to students' unions is, with my previous sabbatical hat on from 20 years ago, was work in partnership with university rather than as sort of something which an institution which is in opposition to you, because I think there's an open door in many respects of working constructively together around these big issues, around things which an institution can do better, which I'm sure many staff and leadership in higher education providers want to do themselves too. So try and be constructive and practical and positive around your relationship with your university to make a difference. And then my final point, Rhodes, is actually the first question. So apologies to do this, but whilst none of us here are going to have an answer around the difference between students and non-students who are young people, because we're not pollsters, I know Public First, our colleagues there have done a lot of work around public opinion on climate change, and which does show you that across the different cross breaks, particularly class, there is a real focus on and support for things like net zero, despite sort of some of the narratives in the media. The challenge, both for government and for universities, because is who pays, and so therefore there needs to be something that we work through around that to make sure whatever initiatives we offer and solutions, that there is some level of social justice at the heart of that too.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to try and take the last 3 questions together so that we can finish in a timely manner. So I've got an anonymous question, and then Iona, I'm going to come to you to hear yours, please. So our first question is about research. How far are undergraduates aware of and involved in research at their universities tackling climate change? And could more be done here to help students' sense of purpose and agency? We've got a comment from Ellie Martin as well, who's based at a small and specialist land-based university. And Ellie's really interested to see what their students' opinions are on that. I don't know where you are, Ellie, but I'm a governor at Hartbury, and I know that they're doing a lot of work on sustainability, and they have a new director of sustainability coming in, because they're going to be at the forefront of a lot of this work, and I'm sure it's very easy to embed sustainability into some of their curricula. I haven't seen Iona pop up, so I will ask. Oh, here she is, Iona.
Yeah, so I'm Iona from the UK Council for International Student Affairs, which probably adds context to the question. But thinking about international students coming to the UK and comparing that to domestic students' experience who likely to have experienced the UK university environment, but international students, especially postgraduates, may have experienced it in their home country as well. Did that come out at all during the focus groups and research, just that kind of the alternative experience, and if there's things that can be learned for universities here?
Okay, who would like to pick up on those selections? Jenny, I don't know if you want to touch on the focus groups with the international students.
Absolutely. Yeah, so thank you, Aina. I'm really glad you've raised that, because one of the primary concerns we heard both from our international students in our focus groups, but also from other students who domestic students who organically brought it up, was the realization, which my fellow all the panelists have touched on, that climate change is happening now. It's already impacted a lot of people in the global south in some particularly devastating ways. We know that people in the global south produce disproportionately less the emissions and the pollution, which then lead to climate change, and yet they bear the brunt of the impact right now. And so it is an issue which is more potentially a lot closer and a lot more intimate to a lot of our international students. We also know that maybe the way that environmental science and climate are talked about and related to in this country compared to different cultures may vary as well. And so one thing that we were really pleased to hear, first of all, that thoughtfulness of our position in the UK as part of a global community to ensure there is that global justice when we try to understand climate change and address it. I was really pleased to see that. But another thing I was really pleased to see as well is an acknowledgement from our focus group participants of the role that Indigenous knowledges can play in addressing climate change and different understandings from other cultures. We can approach this issue with a very, say, Western lens or a very particular lens, but actually there's a wealth of expertise with other approaches across the world that we could definitely benefit from taking on board. So I think international students therefore have that experience and bring that kind of, not conflict I say, but that differing perspective with them. And it's important to make sure in these dialogues, when we are seeking to make changes in addressing climate change and mental well-being, we take those perspectives seriously and we don't exclude them in a way we structure our research investigations, but in also delivering solutions as well.
Thank you. I was really struck by the quote in the report from an international student who said they're in lectures learning about climate change as if it's something that's going to happen in the future. And it was something that was very much already happening in their country. And I thought that was just really struck a chord in terms of how much our students can learn from each other on this. Evelyn, did you want to come in on the research question?
Yes, I think it's one of the biggest things we can do is not just tell students about the research that we're doing, whether it's in engineering, green chemistry, new battery technology, etc., but also engage students in the research that we're doing. Even if you're not an engineer, you might be an advocate for new forms of housing, new uses of materials, new ways of doing composites. And so I want to go back to that student union question and the leadership question that was asked before. It's only by that really close collaborative relationship with not just the students on campus, but also the wider young people within your community, that you can make sure that that sense of hopelessness, there's nothing we can do, is replaced by, actually, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do which are really quite practical. Everything from when you move out and graduate, you don't just dump all your furniture, you actually put it on a free cycle, or you arrange to give it to the next group of students who are moving into their housing. So, giving people really practical solutions, but also engaging them with the research that universities do so they can act as advocates for us or test ideas as citizen scientists, student scientists out in the community. So I actually think this is something that will bring us together because it's a collective threat. It's not just a threat to somebody under the age of 25. It's a threat to all of our futures, to our future vision for the world, as well as to my grandchildren, whom I care about hugely, and in terms of their future. So let's use this not to create a sense of despair, but a sense of coming together to make real solutions to the problems that we face now and in the future.
Thank you. I have a few kind of closing remarks and thank yous to do. Panelists, if you need 30 seconds to do any burning things that you would still like to say, give me a wave. Go on, Eddie.
Very quickly, there were two things I'd like to say. There's a phrase we use in the training session that I talked about earlier with my Teach the Teacher campaign for the global justice aspect, which is same storm, different boats. We're all in the same storm, but different countries are in different boats. We say that the UK is almost a bit like a cruise ship, but other countries in the global south might be like a kayak. And there's a big difference in how we experience that storm. Second point was, as a on the thing in the report about green spaces helping people, helping people's mental health. There's something I meant to say earlier, which was, there was a really nice phrase that I think summarized this, which was nature heals. And that's all the things I wanted to say. Thank you.
Oh, that's such a lovely note to end on, Eddie. Thank you. So just a quick thank you to my colleague Emma, who's hiding, but as always is making everything run incredibly smoothly behind the scenes. Thank you to Student Minds, and particularly to Jenny for kind of creating this really interesting report and giving us this topic to share about. And thank you to the UPP Foundation for supporting the event. And most of all, thank you to all the speakers for joining us today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and gives us lots of food for thought on how to take this forward. Thanks, everyone.